Justin Gale is the senior architect at BRP, where he has led the Google Apps movement since the very beginning. He's going to share some best practices with dealing with a lot of users and in a large enterprise environment. So, Justin, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you if you want to go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Andrew. Good to be here. Good to be back with Guru doing another presentation out to everybody. And with that, I will flip over my presentation and get started. Admin Training Week. We're doing the strategy for introducing new features. As Andrew said, I'm Justin Gale from BRP. A little bit typical who we are. BRP, we're one of the world leaders in design and manufacture marketing of some of the absolute coolest toys in the power sports industry. A little bit about us. We went live on Google in 2012. We have over 5,600 accounts on Google Apps. We're in 40 plus locations, 30 plus countries around the world. A little bit about me. I went Google in 2010, about 2 years before we went Google. People regularly see me using old Chromebooks or even slightly newer Chromebooks for work, blogging, etc. Like Andrew said, I'm the senior Google Apps admin at BRP, one of the first certified administrators for Google Apps. You may hear more from me and from Gary, who you heard on the last session, coming up this summer. We're probably going to do something on that topic. I'm a top contributor over at Google Enterprise Connect for the business, education, and other customers who have access to that. I'm a moderator on a couple Google Plus forums and got my blogs, and I'm on Google Plus as well. If you want to look me up, ask me questions. But we're here today to talk about new features. And I thought about that when they said, hey, can you present on new features? I thought, sure. What's the most important thing to know about new features? I said, well, how do you roll them out? I said, well, what's rolling out? Right? So the key about new features is really that it's a whole roadmap. You have to be informed. You have to share the information with the right folks at the right time. Be aware of what controls and options that Google gives you for doing this, and then take advantage of that. Structure your domain to best suit these new changes or things you want to do in your domain. So stay informed. This is the age-old thing of you can't manage what you don't measure. If you want to have plans or strategies, you got to know what's coming, when it's coming, why it's coming, and what you do about it, right? So how do you do that? Well, Google provides a pretty good site called the What's New site, and that's the what'snew.googleapps.com. One of the things everybody talks about on that site is this kind of real cool looking calendar, release calendar. Tells you about all the stuff that's happening, sort of. And I don't work for Google, and Guru doesn't work for Google. It's a nice utility, nice resource, but even Google doesn't always tell us everything exactly on time. But that site has a lot of cool stuff on it. On that What's New site, you can subscribe to updates to the calendar. Very useful for admins. Why? Because sometimes that's the first place you see announcements from Google. Not always, but sometimes. They've got a really cool monthly summary of changes. So every month, basically in hindsight, they say, this is what happened this past month. All these new features came to your domain. Now, when you look at what happens during the month, you get these little blurbs, hey, we introduced some new Gmail feature, blah, blah, blah. That's great at the time. It's not necessarily the most effective, but looking at the stuff in hindsight, you get some really good insight into things you may have missed, or sometimes they've even written tips or tricks on how to use them better. So I'd highly recommend taking a look at their monthly summaries. On that website, they also talk about their whole release process. And if you're not familiar with Google's release process, we'll talk about it just a little bit here, but it's probably good to review that stuff and be comfortable with it yourself. And finally, that site has some links to blogs that you can subscribe and monitor. And I've written about this kind of thing several times, and I looked over what's there, and I thought, hey, for the folks who cared to attend today, let's give you some bonus listings at the end. So very end of my presentation, I'll give you a few other key sites that you probably want to subscribe to or look at on a regular basis to see, hey, what's going on in the Google world with Google Apps that I might have missed, that I might not have heard of, or that nobody mentioned yet. Once you have all that information, I talked about sharing it. Again, it's all about the plan, right? So you can't roll out something new without a plan. And everybody goes, well, I can just tell everybody. But really, when you think about it, you have to think ahead of time, who are the people you want to tell? I kind of broke it down and said, well, you've probably got your service desk and your support teams. You've got your company or organization-wide communications. Do you have distribution lists set up so that when it's time to do something, you can react and turn on a dime and send that out? People may go, well, why do you need to communicate to your service desk or support team? Well, what if the feature is something that's you read it and it's going to ask a lot of questions, or it's going to have a lot of pop-ups and somebody's going to have to ask, hey, what do I do? You probably want to make sure to tell your support team, your service desk folks immediately so they're prepared and thinking about it and not hit blindside. All right, so share the changes as appropriate. Those monthly summaries, they are really good to send to management type folks and say, hey, here's all the great stuff that Google did for us this past month. You might want to be aware. So let's come to the third point, the controls, new features. When I talk about new features, Google actually breaks it down into features and services. Features are typically things like new sheets, little add-ons in docs, a new icon or a new option or new font, in your Gmail application. But services, these are a bit bigger. These are things like Google Plus, Mail, Sites, Helpouts, the real big things. So where do you go to find all this stuff? How do you configure it? That's very easy. You go into the Google admin panel, choose company profile. It's that funny looking building icon with a gear. And in there you'll see options for new user features and new services. I pulled this slide right out of Google and I find it interesting. Almost all the time when they talk about the release tracks, they talk about rapid and scheduled. The early adopters and the standard adopters. Google's documentation, and you can see why they say, hey, this is recommended, is let's start with the scheduled track, to tell you about it. And, choose this track to get something, not immediately. It gives you a little extra time. They say they always release on Tuesdays, only at least 1 week after a feature was released to Rapid. In Rapid, hey, this is the cutting edge, right? If something's new from Google and you want to be on it and you want to get it first, be on Rapid. But you're kind of the testers for everybody else, so you got to be a little bit careful when you choose Rapid. This comes right from Google. Let's break that down a little bit differently, because for me, Google uses a bit too many words and options. Rapid release. You get it automatically as soon as it's available. There is no notice, or there's often no advance notice. So if Google decides for whatever reason that there's going to be a Thursday change, bang, you have it because you're rapid release. Scheduled release, typically, 1 to 2 weeks later after rapid release. That's not always the case, just because everybody forgets. There were things like some of the Gmail New Compose, for example, right? That went rapid release to scheduled release, and you didn't measure it in weeks, you measured it in months. So not everything follows 1 to 2 weeks. We get so used to working with Google, so used to working with the cloud, where everything is just happening. But not everything always happens that quick. The transition to new sheets was not a 1 to 2 week delay. It was, like 6+ weeks. So rapid versus scheduled, Google says it, and this is my tip to you. Most organizations choose scheduled. You have time to prepare, time to communicate. Now, some things to remember, and you won't find these written down. All right. With either track you choose, rollout is gradual. The second they announce it for rapid Doesn't mean everybody's got it. They have to go through millions of accounts. It may take hours, maybe minutes, hours. It may even be several days between, that day they announce the feature and the day it's available in your domain. So don't panic is the point. Be aware you scheduled a rapid, and you should typically get it, within a few days of doing that. Scheduled releases, again, typically 1 to 2 weeks after rapid release. That little calendar we showed from the What's New site kind of shows you how that's pretty consistent, pretty good. But there is a disclaimer from Google. That is, this rapid and scheduled stuff only applies to Gmail, Calendar, Drive, and Sites. Doesn't apply to things like Google+. Doesn't necessarily apply to things like these login challenges that we've seen. Just to be aware, the hard and fast rule about managing new features with Google is there is not a hard and fast rule. Everything kind of comes on its own little schedule, subject to variation. Best thing is to be informed and be prepared. So let's talk about implementing some of these controls. What does this let us do? We've got 2 settings, rapid release and scheduled release. But we also have a setting about enabling these new services. Do we want them to happen automatically, or do we want them to start where they're not enabled? All right, so you go, why would you want that? Well, what if they introduced, Google Super Hangout 2.0? Do you want that automatically? Then you choose Auto Enable. If you don't want that automatically, you choose Manual Enable. What this lets us do, I think, is pretty cool. You have basically four levels of rollout, right? From real aggressive, choosing rapid release and auto enable, to fairly conservative, scheduled release and manual enabled services. Just something to think about is, where do you guys fit? What's your organization's tolerance for rapid change? And what's your comfort for rapid change, right? Most people tend to fall more on the conservative side, sometimes all the way to the right, and sometimes at that more middle section where we're scheduled release, but we'll take the new services when they come out and are available to us. Now, how do you structure, how do you plan, how do you really deal with all these things? Well, for us, it was easy. We're a big global Active Directory shop. We saw Google, and we saw this really cool thing in there called organizations. They are one of the best kept secrets of Google Apps. Google currently uses organizations to separate the users and control various access to services, etc. A lot of people want to model their Google organization after their LDAP or Active Directory structure. You probably don't want to do that. You probably have too many levels, too much complexity. Really, the best practice is keep it simple. Don't create too many orgs. Create only what you need. And remember, if you're just starting out, it is far easier to give more, to add features and options than it is to take away or lock down. So you probably want to start out with the least amount of stuff open and add things as you need or as you require. So when should you use orgs then? Use them if you really have to delegate administrative functions. Use them to help you test, to pilot things, and to roll out new features. Like Google+, some of Google's mobile device management, or mobile device synchronization. Now, why do I say test, pilot, and rollout? Because those are very different functions, and we'll talk about them in a few minutes. But testing is really something that you guys are going to want to do as admins, so you can put 1 or 2 users somewhere and see what's happening and not impact everybody. When you decide, hey, my tests are good, I'm ready to throw a few more people in there. You may have a pilot organization where you're running these people in, and you go, okay, this is good, and you may roll everybody into that, or not. But those are great use cases for multiple organizations inside your domain. Going into more details on that, and this is pretty much the same thing I talked about a couple months ago on setting up Google Plus for folks who don't have it turned on but want to turn it on for some people. All right, we make a new organization in Google because it's not active yet, and we want to enable it. First thing we're going to have to do is go in via that other Google services, find Google Plus, and I tried to do screenshots of the icons here because it's a little bit scary. You'll see an on or on for some organizations. That's the setting you really want when you're doing selectively turning it on. So turn it on for some organizations. I've got a couple more screenshots kind of showing here. You know, hey, I'm looking at Google Plus. It's inherited for different things, and it's off, but that's not what I want, right? I really want to turn it on. So we'll go back. Really want to turn that on, so go ahead and turn that on. Key things when you're playing around with these on and off settings, pay attention to what's red in your org structure, and then pay attention on the other side if it's on or off, and don't forget to hit apply or cancel. Very key points. Thought I'd give a bunch of examples, and I know I saw a few questions on the moderator about this, talking about org structures and how do we manage and how do other customers that I know manage. A lot of folks, when they go live, they just create one organization, all right, and they have all their users in that. You know, let's just pretend it's called, you know, regular users. But you say, I want to play with some settings. I want to play with some advanced email settings, content compliance, or, you know, mobile device security, and try locking something down, or, you know, disabling synchronization. So create a test org. That's okay, right? You can have as many orgs as you want, but keep it simple. Call them something meaningful so that you know when you're looking at it kind of what this is about and why it's there. Now let's expand that, kind of give you a visual view. This would be that same regular users test org structure, and say now I want to roll out Google Plus. Just like we did in a little step-by-step, it's okay to add another org and call it Google Plus. I start out with 2 organizations, end up with 3. Well, let's make it more complex. Oftentimes get asked, what do I do if I turned on Google and I opened the doors to absolutely everything? I had every service enabled, every feature active, and you know, I really didn't want to do that. How do you get there? What do you do? Well, what I'd propose is let's do that slowly. Let's use organizations to help us get there. Again, we kind of start out, we have whatever our original structure is. Let's add a new organization, and I just called it restrictive services, where we're going to change our configuration to what we want. We'll start putting users in there. Again, why I say slowly and why we're doing this is because we weren't ready, for whatever reason, to just apply these changes to the entire Google Apps ecosystem. We wanted to just start doing it, maybe by location, by department, etc. So we use this intermediate structure, and when everybody's over, we change that regular users organization to have just what we want. We move everybody back, and we've just affected change on our entire domain, you know, without anything real traumatic to our users, and we used orgs to help us do that. But let's get more complex, right? That's an easy one, but usually we got several projects going on at once. So how do I manage several projects going on? I manage it the exact same way. You know, I've got my initial structure with my regular users and my test orgs, so we can test things. And they say, hey, Justin, we want to roll out Google Plus. Okay. We also want to roll out mobile security. Right? Mobile security is kind of a neat one, just because there's a lot of stuff tied with that. Now, what you can do in this case is you can actually have some of your orgs have duplicate settings, right? Be subsets. Or, in this case, I put mobile device security with Google Plus, and I created an org called restricted sync, where I took away everybody's ability to sync their devices. Now, why would I use a structure like this? It's going to allow me to have, like a Google Apps-based workflow where people get a form, they fill it out, they acknowledge policy, and if they acknowledge policy, they get put into one org. If they don't acknowledge policy by a certain time frame, they get put into another org. So now what we've been able to do with that kind of workflow and that kind of structure on our intermediate box here is I can roll out Google Plus and restrict users who aren't acknowledging policy. When we get all done and have everybody in one or the other boxes, just like our previous example, we can change the base and reset, what is normal. So the new normal will be restricted access. Conclusions about using orgs. They're absolutely very powerful. We all hope someday Google will adopt a group model. They haven't yet. Everything is org-based. So we need to think about that, think simple, think the fact that a user can only be a member of one organization, which means, again, why we don't want to have too many different things going on at once, too many different orgs with different features and functions. Geography obviously works because user is not in more than one place. However, if you have geography and multiple things you're rolling out, you have 3 locations, and you have 2 new things, suddenly you have 6 new orgs that you make, or 9 new orgs that you make for migrating. So again, really try to keep it simple. You can use orgs to not just roll out new features, you can also use orgs to take things away from people. Say, hey, I don't want Google Wallet, I don't want helpouts, I don't want some other setting. So you can remove that, put people in an organization with it, prove it out. And when you're comfortable, reset the default settings and move forward. Another key thing to kind of remember is it is okay to delete orgs that you don't need. This is cloud. This is dynamic. This is something that's not etched in stone. The structure is meant to change to meet your business needs. And Google provides us with something fairly easy to do that. So take advantage of it. Use it. Have fun with it. Again, just don't go too crazy creating orgs to the point where you create work for yourself and your team. Go with a simple structure. It is much easier to manage. All right, now for the good bonus section for everybody who stayed tuned this far. These are sites you will not find listed on the What's New, but I have written about them and follow them myself, find them to be great sources of information. First one is the unofficial Google blog by Alex Shidu. He sometimes even scoops Google on announcing things. Tells you a lot of features that you didn't know about, how to use them, and when they're coming. Follow him. It's worth your time. Second one is the Google Enterprise posts on Google+. If you look it over, you see that they actually do post a lot of their new stuff more and more right here on Google Enterprise. So great thing to look at. Follow it, put it in your circles, pay attention. A lot of announcements, obviously, about organizations going Google and other things, webinars, etc. But they do post some of those key announcements of new features, and that's really what we're trying to find out, trying to stay on top of, to be able to share and communicate. For customers, large businesses, large organizations, a lot of the EDU space, you've been probably previously invited to something called Google Enterprise Connect. I know they're still adding a lot of folks into that. Great resource. A lot of very, very expert customers out there and knowledgeable people that I like to chat with and ask questions of. Last source is Engadget. You'll find a lot of other news out there, but Engadget does post quite a bit about Google. Very worth your while. You can take all these sites, because they're all RSS feeds, put them in your favorite news reader. Years ago, I used to say, hey, use Google Reader. That went away. I was all set to tell everybody, hey, use Feedly, but that's been suffering some denial of service attacks this week. It's currently up, and I've been using that back again until I change my mind. But really don't like to pull all this stuff into email, because honestly, once a week, 2 weeks goes by, you really just aren't as interested anymore, right? It's about what's coming next. And that release calendar from Google, pretty good place, and all these other blogs, really good place to find out what you've got. So that's it. I thought we'd open it up to some questions with Andrew and everybody. If anybody has any questions for me, I've listed my personal email address for you. You can also find me, online on Google Plus as well.
All right, thanks a lot, Justin. Let's start taking a look at some of these questions. A lot of questions about handling rapid and scheduled releases. So first question here, we'd like to have the early adopters be in an OU for rapid release track and the rest of our organization in scheduled release. It looks like everybody has to be on the same track. Is that right?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's one track per domain. There is a solution to this, and I know that that's going to be talked about in an upcoming session, so I won't spoil too much. But for those who don't know, get yourself a test domain. All right, you can have a test domain with, you have to name them funny, usually like test.yourdomain.com. Google typically gives those for free to, Google Apps, paying customers, EDU type customers, etc. And that you can set on rapid to see what's going on.
Yeah, so that will be covered in our session later today, handling test domains. So thank you for that nice tease, Justin. So that actually covers a couple of our top questions that we have here. Another question, if you do choose scheduled release and manual enable for features, is there a cutoff point, like a number of days or weeks or months, at which Google will force enable the new features?
No. So it's a good question, but the reality is those new features for the most part are services. They can sit not enabled forever. You may choose to enable it. You may choose not to enable it, right? Depending on your location, your legal requirements, etc. Great examples might be things like Google Wallet, Helpouts. It really just depends on your organization, where you are in the world, and what your governing things say about what you can and can't have and do. Again, like all things Google, for the folks that caught it yesterday, there was an announcement about premium features being opted in for everybody, regardless of what your settings were. So I think, Andrew, that was a great example, real life, real time, of how Google has the rules. We need to know, hey, be aware of them, but also know that the rules do sometimes change.
We were talking about the Google Enterprise Connect. Can you just remind everybody how people get access to that if they're Google Apps admin?
Yep. They have provisioned a lot of domains. I know they're still provisioning more. Basically, you go to that website, connect.googleenterprise.com, and hit connect, and should be passed through. Inside of there's an admin forum. There's a users community, continually kind of growing space right now. For those who have been members of a lot of the Google groups, like for the EDU or North America or Canada or some of the other Google groups where we had support kind of running, they all transitioned into Google Enterprise Connect and have been expanding ever since.
Just a simple question. Can a user be a part of more than one organization?
And I don't know who asked that, but that's something a lot of us ask, and the answer, unfortunately, is no. You can only be a member of one organization, and we're all just really crossing our fingers that Google will bring a groups model of administration one of these months, one of these years to Google to let us have a more traditional way of managing.
We've got another question about using Google Directory Sync from. So when using Google Directory Sync from an Active Directory domain, will newly created OUs outside the synced OUs remain on the next sync, or will they disappear again on the next sync?
Newly created. I just kind of thinking that through. I believe it depends on your settings, right? But I think they will disappear. Now,
Okay.
it's a great point to talk about orgs and GADs. For people who don't know, GADs is Google Apps Directory Sync. A lot of larger customers use it. However, a lot of folks, ourselves included, don't use it to sync orgs. That's not to say we don't sync our users into the orgs. We don't use it for creating organizations, strictly for moving users from one org to another. That way you never run into a problem of anything like that. Kind of an interesting way of doing it, but it keeps that level of admin control